You look disgusting, Mom. You're embarrassing me. Go hide somewhere. Those were the exact words my son whispered to me on the morning of his wedding. Not yesterday. Not years ago. Just 3 hours before he was supposed to say, I do. And I still remember the way his voice sounded. Cold. Sharp. Ashamed of me. I stood there in the hallway of that luxury hotel ballroom, holding the small gift box I had bought for him. A silver watch engraved with the words, "For the boy who made me a mother." My hands started trembling. For a moment I thought maybe I had misheard him. And Michael, what did you say? I asked softly. He sighed like I was some annoying stranger bothering him. I said you look disgusting, Mom, he repeated. Look at that dress. Look at your hair. You look like you came from a thrift store. All my friends are here. My fiancé's family is here. Do you know how embarrassing this is? I felt something heavy settle inside my chest. Because the truth was, the dress was from a thrift store. And the shoes were 10 years old. And the small purse I was holding had been repaired twice. But not because I didn't care about my son's wedding. No. It was because every single dollar I had gone into his future. I'm Eleanor Reyes. I'm 72 years old. And the man who had just called me disgusting is the boy I raised alone after his father died. But before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you the moment that left an entire wedding hall dead silent, let me ask you something. If your own child said that to you, what would you do? And if you believe parents deserve respect after sacrificing everything for their children, take a second to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this happen more often than people think. Now let me tell you how it all started. I raised Michael by myself. His father died in a construction accident when Michael was just 4 years old. I still remember the hospital hallway, the smell of disinfectant, the doctor avoiding my eyes, and the way my little boy held my hand and asked, Mom, when is Daddy coming home? From that moment on, it was just the two of us. 2 people against the world. I worked 3 jobs. Morning shift at a diner. Afternoons cleaning houses. Night shifts at a grocery store. Sometimes I slept only 3 hours a night. But Michael never knew. To him, life still had birthday cakes, school field trips, new sneakers every year. Because I made sure of it. When he wanted to play baseball, I paid for the league. When he needed a laptop for college, I took out a loan. When he got accepted into business school, I sold my late husband's old pickup truck to help pay his tuition. I told everyone the same thing. My son is going to have a better life than I did. And for a long time he did. Michael graduated, got a great job in marketing, started wearing expensive suits, driving nicer cars than I had ever sat in. Then one day he called me. Mom, he said excitedly. I met someone. Her name was Vanessa Caldwell. Her family owned half the real estate in our city. Her father was the kind of man who shook hands with senators. The first time I met Vanessa's parents, I could already feel the difference between our worlds. Their house had marble floors, a chandelier bigger than my living room, and a dinner table that probably cost more than my entire house. Vanessa's mother smiled politely at me that night, but her eyes kept drifting to my old handbag, to my worn coat, to the fact that I didn't belong. After dinner, Michael pulled me aside. Mom, maybe next time dress a little more elegant. I laughed it off then. I thought he was nervous, trying to impress his future in-laws. I didn't realize something had already started changing inside him. Something quiet, something ugly, something that would finally show itself. On the day of his wedding, 3 hours before the ceremony, Michael looked at me again and shook his head. You can't sit in the front row looking like that, he said. Mom, just go sit somewhere in the back. Or maybe wait outside. Outside. At my own son's wedding. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to smile. Of course, sweetheart, I said quietly. Whatever makes you happy. He didn't even notice the tears in my eyes. He had already turned around, laughing with his groomsmen. That was the moment something inside me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like glass cracking under pressure. And as I walked away from the hallway, I made a decision that would make every guest in that ballroom stop breathing. Because 3 hours later, when the music stopped, When the bride and groom stood on the stage. When hundreds of guests raised their glasses to celebrate my son. I picked up the microphone. And I told them the truth. But what I said next. I walked slowly down the hotel hallway after my son told me to hide. Each step felt heavier than the last. Around me the wedding venue buzzed with excitement. Bridesmaids were laughing. Waiters carried trays of champagne. Someone nearby was practicing a violin piece for the ceremony. Everything looked beautiful. Perfect. And yet, inside my chest something had quietly shattered. I stepped into the ladies' restroom and locked myself in the last stall. For a moment I simply stood there, holding the edge of the sink and staring at my reflection in the mirror. My hair was gray and pinned neatly into a bun. My dress was simple, navy blue modest, something a 72-year-old grandmother might wear proudly. But suddenly I saw myself through my son's eyes. Old. Embarrassing. Out of place. You look disgusting, Mom. The words echoed again in my head. My hands began shaking. Not from anger. From heartbreak. Because the truth is, I didn't just love Michael. I had built my entire life around him. Every sacrifice. Every sleepless night. Every dream I quietly gave up. All of it had been for that boy. And somehow, somewhere along the way, he had started being ashamed of me. A tear slipped down my cheek. I quickly wiped it away. No, I whispered to myself. You are not going to cry today. I took a deep breath. Then another. And something inside me slowly changed. Not rage. Not bitterness. Something calmer. Something colder. Because in that moment, I realized something important. My son believed he had all the power. He believed I was just an old woman who would quietly sit in the back row and clap for him. He believed I would stay silent. But what Michael didn't understand was that I had been silent for 30 years. And today, I didn't have to be. About 20 minutes later I stepped outside the restroom and walked toward the ballroom. The doors were slightly open, and I could see inside. The place looked like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above hundreds of white chairs. Flowers covered every table. A huge golden arch stood at the altar where my son would soon stand with his bride. Guests in designer suits and elegant gowns filled the room. Vanessa's family had clearly spent a fortune. I spotted Michael near the front, laughing with his groomsmen. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, confident, proud, and completely unaware that his own mother was standing just outside the door, deciding his future. I watched him for a long moment. Memories flooded my mind. The day he took his first steps. The time he cried after losing his first baseball game. The night he called me from college because he missed home. Where had that boy gone? When had he turned into this stranger? Then I heard Vanessa's mother speaking to a group of guests nearby. Oh yes, she said with a small laugh. Michael worked very hard to build himself up. He really came from very humble beginnings. The way she said humble made my stomach tighten. One of the women beside her asked quietly, "Will his mother be here today?" Vanessa's mother smiled politely. "Oh, I believe she's somewhere around. Somewhere around. Like I was a distant relative. Or maybe a housekeeper." I turned away before they could see me. That was the moment my decision became final. If my son was ashamed of where he came from, then maybe it was time everyone learned the truth about how he got there. The ceremony began an hour later. I took a seat in the very back row, just like Michael had wanted. No one paid much attention to me, which was exactly what I needed. The music started. Guests stood. Vanessa walked down the aisle in a beautiful white dress that probably cost more than my first car. Michael looked at her like she was the center of the universe. They exchanged vows. The audience applauded. They kissed. Everyone cheered. And for a moment, I wondered if I should just let it go. Maybe I should simply clap with the others. Smile. Go home quietly. But then I remembered his voice in that hallway. "You look disgusting, Mom." And I remembered every sacrifice I had made for him. Every birthday I worked through. Every bill I struggled to pay. Every dream I gave up so he could chase his. No. This wasn't about revenge. This was about respect. And respect cannot exist without truth. 2 hours later the reception began. The ballroom filled with music, laughter, and champagne. Guests gathered around the stage where speeches were about to start. Vanessa's father spoke first. He gave a long speech about family legacy, success, and how proud he was to welcome Michael into their world. Then the best man spoke. Then the maid of honor. Everyone laughed and clapped. Finally, the DJ picked up the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "before we move on to dinner, does anyone else have something they'd like to say?" My heart started beating faster. This was the moment. I slowly stood from my chair. At first, no one noticed. Then I began walking toward the stage. One step at a time. The DJ looked confused as I approached. "Ma'am," he asked politely. "I'm the groom's mother," I said gently. "I think I'd like to say a few words." He smiled and handed me the microphone. Behind me, hundreds of guests turned in their seats. Michael looked up from the head table, and when he saw me standing there, I watched the color drain from his face, because he suddenly remembered something. His mother had always been a quiet woman, but she had never been a weak one. I looked out across the ballroom, at the wealthy guests, at Vanessa's powerful family, at my son sitting there in his expensive tuxedo. Then I raised the microphone to my lips, and I said the one sentence that made the entire room fall silent. 3 hours ago, my son told me I looked disgusting and that I was embarrassing him. You could hear a glass drop somewhere in the room, but that was only the beginning, because the next thing I told those guests would change my son's life forever. The moment I said those words into the microphone, the entire ballroom froze. You know that strange kind of silence? The kind that falls when people realize something uncomfortable is about to happen? That was the silence filling the room. Hundreds of guests sat there staring at me. Some were confused. Some looked curious. Others already looked nervous. My son Michael sat at the head table beside his new wife, Vanessa. The color had completely drained from his face. "Mom," he whispered under his breath. But his voice didn't reach the microphone. Mine did. And tonight, for the first time in a very long time, people were finally going to hear it. I cleared my throat softly and looked around the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt the celebration," I said calmly. "I promise I won't take too much of your time." A few guests shifted in their chairs. Vanessa's father folded his arms. Vanessa herself looked confused, glancing between me and Michael. Michael was staring at me like he was begging me to stop. But it was too late for that. "You see," I continued, "a few hours ago, before the ceremony started, my son pulled me aside in the hallway." My voice remained steady, even though my heart was pounding. He looked at my dress, and then he said something that surprised me. Across the room I saw people leaning forward slightly. People love a wedding speech. But this wasn't the kind they expected. He said, "Mom, you look disgusting. You're embarrassing me. Go hide somewhere." A murmur spread through the crowd. Soft at first, then louder. Some guests looked toward Michael. Others looked at me with wide eyes. One woman near the front actually covered her mouth. Vanessa slowly turned toward her husband. "Michael," she whispered. Michael immediately stood up. "Mom, that's not what I meant," he said quickly. "You're misunderstanding." I raised my hand gently. "Oh, sweetheart," I said calmly. "I understood you perfectly." A few quiet gasps moved through the room. Michael sat down again, clearly realizing that arguing with a microphone involved was not going to help him. I took a slow breath. "You know," I continued, "when my son said that it hurt." I paused. But not because of the dress. I looked down at it for a moment. This dress cost $12 at a thrift store. More whispers. "And these shoes," I added, lifting one foot slightly, "are 10 years old." A few guests exchanged awkward looks. But the reason I wore them today isn't because I don't care about appearances. I looked straight at my son. It's because I spent the last 30 years making sure my son could have a better life than I ever did. Now the room was completely silent again. "I worked 3 jobs when Michael was little," I continued. "I waited tables in the mornings. I cleaned houses in the afternoons. And I stocked shelves at a grocery store at night." Across the ballroom, someone slowly lowered their champagne glass. I kept speaking. "I missed birthdays. I missed holidays. I missed sleep." My voice softened slightly. But Michael never missed anything. I looked back at him. You had baseball uniforms, remember? He stared at the table. You had new sneakers every year. No response. And when you got into college? I paused. I sold your father's truck to pay for your tuition. Now the whispers had stopped completely. Even the waiters standing along the walls were listening. Vanessa looked at Michael again. You told me your parents helped pay for college, she said quietly. Michael didn't answer. I continued speaking into the microphone. I never told Michael how hard those years were, I said. Because parents don't do things like that for praise. I looked around the room. We do it because we love our children. Then I turned back to my son. But today, when you looked at me and said I was embarrassing you, I shook my head slowly. That was the first time in my life I realized something. The guests waited. The room felt like it was holding its breath. My son is ashamed of where he came from. Vanessa's mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Vanessa's father leaned forward, studying Michael with a much colder expression than before. Michael suddenly stood again. Mom, please stop, he said through clenched teeth. His voice was quieter now. Desperate. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't yelling. I was simply telling the truth. And truth has a strange power. Once it starts coming out, it rarely stops. You see, I said gently into the microphone. There's something else my son forgot to mention today. Now people were leaning forward again. Curious. Waiting. I glanced toward the large windows of the ballroom. Outside, the evening lights of the city were glowing. Then I said the sentence that would make this wedding impossible to forget. The house my son lives in, the one he proudly showed Vanessa's family. Michael's head snapped up. Mom, belongs to me. A loud murmur exploded across the room. Vanessa's eyes widened. What? She whispered. I nodded calmly. Yes, I continued. The house on Maplewood Drive. The one worth nearly $800,000. I paused. I bought it 10 years ago. More whispers. But when Michael got engaged, I told him something. I looked directly at him. I told him that one day, that house would become his. Vanessa turned fully toward her husband now. You told me your father left you that house, she said slowly. Michael didn't respond. Because he couldn't. Every guest in the room was watching him now. But the real surprise, the part that would leave this entire ballroom speechless, hadn't even happened yet. Because the next thing I was about to tell them would change everything about my son's future. And when I finally said it, even the DJ forgot how to breathe. I stood there, gripping the microphone while hundreds of eyes stared at me. The wedding hall that had been buzzing with laughter only minutes ago had turned so quiet that I could hear the faint clinking of glasses from the back tables. My son's face had gone pale. He looked at me the same way someone looks at a storm rolling in across the ocean. Like he knew something big was about to hit, but he had no idea how powerful it would be. He stepped toward me quickly and whispered through his teeth. Mom, stop this right now. You're ruining my wedding. I looked straight into his eyes. The same eyes I had watched open for the first time in a hospital room 34 years earlier. And for a second, just a second, I felt my heart crack again. But then I remembered his words. You look disgusting. You're embarrassing me. I took a slow breath and turned back to the crowd. My name is Margaret Carter, I said calmly into the microphone. And I'm the woman who raised the groom standing right here. Some guests nodded politely. Others looked confused. A few of the older relatives already seemed uneasy, like they could sense this wasn't going to be a sweet mother of the groom speech. I continued. When my husband died, my son Daniel was only 7 years old. I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. I cleaned houses in the morning, and I worked night shifts at a diner. I saw a few guests exchanging glances. My son never went hungry. He never missed a birthday gift. And when he wanted to go to college, I sold the only house I had left from my parents just to help pay his tuition. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside his bride. The room was still dead silent. But today, I said slowly, my voice steady but heavy with emotion, my son told me something that I think everyone here deserves to hear. Daniel suddenly grabbed my arm. Mom, stop. But I gently pulled away. No, Daniel. You said it loud enough earlier. I'm sure you won't mind if I repeat it. A ripple of tension moved through the crowd. I lifted the microphone closer. Just 20 minutes ago, my son looked at me and said, "Mom, you look disgusting. Go hide somewhere. You're embarrassing me." Gasps spread across the room like a wave. Some guests literally turned toward Daniel in disbelief. His bride's smile disappeared instantly. One of Daniel's friends muttered, "Dude, what?" Daniel's face turned red. "That's not what I meant," he started. But I raised my hand calmly. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "That's exactly what you meant." For a moment my voice trembled, and I felt tears forming in my eyes. "I came here today wearing my best dress. I even had my hair done for the first time in years because I wanted to look nice for my son's wedding." I swallowed the lump in my throat. But apparently that wasn't good enough. The room felt heavy now. You could practically feel people's sympathy shifting toward me. Some of the older women in the audience were already wiping their eyes. Then I smiled slightly, not a sad smile but a calm one. "But you know something funny?" I said. "My son isn't wrong about one thing." Daniel looked confused. I looked at the crowd again. "You see, I may not look like much today. I'm just an old woman with wrinkles and gray hair." I paused. "But there's one thing about me that my son forgot." The room leaned in closer. My name might not impress anyone here. I took a slow breath. "But the things I've done with my life?" I smiled quietly. "Oh honey, those might surprise you." Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" And that's when I looked straight at him and said the words that made the entire room start whispering. "You see, Daniel, the house you've been bragging about to your friends all night?" His eyes widened. "Yes," I continued softly. "The one you keep telling everyone you're about to inherit." The room froze. "Well," I leaned slightly toward the microphone. "I made a little change to that plan this morning." And the second I said that, Daniel's confident smile completely disappeared, because he suddenly realized this speech wasn't just a story. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And the next thing I was about to reveal was going to change his life forever. The moment I said I had made a little change to the house Daniel thought he was inheriting, the entire wedding hall shifted. People who had been casually sipping champagne suddenly leaned forward in their chairs. I could see curiosity spreading across the room like a spark catching dry grass. Daniel stared at me like he had misheard. "Mom, what change?" he asked, forcing out a laugh that sounded painfully fake. I could hear the nervousness in his voice. That same boy who had once clung to my hand when he was afraid of thunderstorms was now standing in front of hundreds of guests. Realizing something was slipping out of his control, I held the microphone calmly and looked at him. "You've been telling everyone tonight that the Carter family house will soon be yours," I said gently. A few guests nodded. Apparently, they had heard him bragging earlier. Daniel straightened his suit jacket and tried to smile again. "Well, yeah," he said. "It's the family house." I tilted my head slightly. "Oh, sweetheart," I replied softly. "That house was never really yours." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Daniel's bride slowly turned her head toward him, confusion written all over her face. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, his voice suddenly tense. I took a deep breath. "That house belonged to my parents. After they passed, it came to me. I kept it for decades because I wanted you to have security one day. A place where your children could run through the same halls you did." For a moment my voice softened with memory. I kept that house through layoffs, hospital bills, and years when I could barely afford groceries. There were times I almost sold it, but I didn't. I looked directly at him, because I believed one day it would help you build a good life. Daniel crossed his arms. "Okay, so what's the problem?" he said defensively. "That house is still yours eventually." The room was watching every second now. Even the DJ had stopped moving. I slowly shook my head. "No, Daniel." And the moment those two words left my mouth, a wave of whispers swept through the guests. "No," he repeated. "No," I said calmly. "You see, something very interesting happened this morning." I paused long enough that the silence felt almost electric. "This morning, I visited a lawyer." Daniel's smile vanished completely. "And together," I continued, We finalized the paperwork for that house. A woman in the front row gasped quietly. Daniel took a step toward me. What paperwork? He demanded. I could feel my heart beating hard in my chest, but my voice remained steady. The paperwork that transfers the ownership of the Carter house, I said. Daniel blinked. So it's finally in my name? I looked at him with the same patient expression I used when he was a child asking a question. He didn't want the real answer to. No, Daniel. The silence that followed was almost painful. It isn't in your name. For a few seconds he didn't move. Then he laughed again, louder this time. Okay, Mom, very funny. So whose name is it in? I turned slightly toward the audience. Actually, it's not in anyone's name. The confusion in the room grew. Daniel's bride frowned. What does that even mean? Daniel snapped. I lifted the microphone again and spoke clearly. This morning, I donated the Carter house to a housing charity that builds homes for single mothers and their children. The reaction was immediate. Gasps. Whispers. Several people even started clapping quietly in shock. Daniel, however, looked like the floor had just disappeared beneath him. You what? He shouted. I nodded calmly. Yes. The house will now be used to shelter families who truly need it. Daniel's face turned crimson. You gave away my house? He yelled. I looked at him gently. No, sweetheart, I said. I gave away my house. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like everyone was holding their breath. Daniel looked around at the guests, suddenly realizing they were all watching him. And many of them did not look impressed. His bride slowly stepped away from him. And that's when I leaned closer to the microphone and said something that made the entire room fall silent again. But that house donation? I paused. That wasn't the real surprise I planned for today. Daniel's head snapped back toward me. What are you talking about? I smiled faintly. Because the truth is, the house was only the first thing I took away from my son tonight. And the moment I said that, Daniel's confident world began to crumble even faster. Because he had no idea. The moment I said the house was only the first thing I had taken away from my son, the room fell into a silence so deep it almost felt heavy. People shifted in their chairs. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Even the soft music playing in the background had faded into nothing but a faint hum from the speakers. Daniel stared at me like he was looking at a stranger. Mom, what are you doing? He asked quietly, his voice no longer angry but nervous. And for a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Fear. Not the kind of fear a child has of the dark, but the kind of fear a grown man feels when he realizes the truth might finally catch up with him. I held the microphone gently in my hands and took a slow breath. You know, I said softly to the guests, when Daniel was little, he used to hide behind my legs whenever strangers came into the house. A few guests smiled awkwardly. He was shy. Sweet. The kind of boy who cried when he saw injured animals. I looked at him. That boy used to promise me he would always take care of me when I got older. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mom, this isn't the time. But I continued. Somewhere along the way, though, something changed. I looked out across the crowd again. My son grew successful. He got a great job. Started making more money than I ever dreamed of. There were a few approving nods from people who clearly knew Daniel's career. And I was proud of him, I said. My voice softened. I bragged about him to everyone at the grocery store, the bank, even the pharmacist. But then I paused. Until something strange started happening. The guests leaned in again. Daniel stopped visiting. I could see Daniel clenching his jaw. He stopped calling. The bride shifted uncomfortably beside him. And when I got sick last winter, I continued quietly, I spent 3 days in the hospital. Several guests looked surprised. My son lives 20 minutes away. I paused again. And he never came. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Daniel suddenly spoke up loudly. That's not fair, Mom. I was busy. I turned toward him slowly. Busy for 3 days? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. No one spoke. Daniel looked away. And that's when I said the part one had never told anyone before. You see, the house wasn't the only thing Daniel thought he was getting from me. Several guests frowned. What do you mean? someone whispered from the back. I looked at Daniel again. For the last 5 years, I said calmly, my son has been telling people that when I pass away, he will also inherit my savings. Daniel froze. His bride's eyes widened. Oh yes, I continued gently. The retirement account I built over 40 years of working. A guest near the front whispered, wow. Daniel quickly grabbed the microphone from the stand beside me. Mom, stop talking, he hissed. But I gently took the microphone back. No, Daniel, I said quietly. Tonight you asked me to hide because I embarrassed you. I looked out at the guests. So I figured, if I'm already embarrassing you, I might as well finish the job. A few people let out shocked laughs. Daniel's face had gone completely pale. Mom, what did you do? He asked slowly. I smiled softly. Well, sweetheart, just like the house, I made another little decision this morning. The tension in the room returned instantly. What decision? He asked. I leaned closer to the microphone. The money you've been waiting for all these years. Daniel's hands curled into fists. Yes, he said. I nodded calmly. It's gone. Gasps filled the room again. Daniel's voice cracked. You're lying. I shook my head gently. No, Daniel. I donated every single dollar to the same charity. The room exploded into whispers. Someone actually started clapping again. Daniel looked like he had been punched in the chest. That was my inheritance, he shouted. I looked at him quietly. No, I said. That was my life's work. For a moment we just stared at each other. And then I said something that made several guests cover their mouths in shock. But the money and the house still aren't the most painful lesson you're about to learn tonight. Daniel blinked slowly. What are you talking about now? I gave a small, tired smile. Because there's one more truth about my son. I paused. One that none of you here know yet. The room leaned forward again. And when I tell you what Daniel did last year. I took a breath. You'll understand why I decided today was the perfect day to finally tell the truth. Daniel's voice came out barely above a whisper. Mom, don't. But I looked straight at the crowd. Because what I was about to reveal next. When I said there was one more truth about my son that nobody in that room knew. The entire wedding hall felt like it had frozen in time. No one was whispering anymore. No glasses were clinking. It was as if every single person there had suddenly realized this wasn't just a dramatic speech anymore. This was the truth of a family, unraveling in front of them. Daniel looked at me with eyes that were now wide with panic. Mom, please, he said quietly. You've made your point. But I shook my head gently. No, Daniel. I replied softly. I haven't. I turned toward the guests again and held the microphone with both hands, steadying myself. You see, I said slowly. Last year something happened that changed the way I saw my son forever. The bride looked between us nervously. What happened? Someone asked from the back of the room. I took a breath before answering. Last year I had surgery. Several guests nodded politely, assuming it was just another part of the story. But then I continued. It wasn't a small surgery. The room grew quieter again. It was heart surgery. Now people looked genuinely surprised. I was terrified, I admitted softly. I'm not ashamed to say that. When you're older, hospitals feel different. You start thinking about things you never used to think about. I paused, remembering that cold hospital room. The night before the surgery, I called my son. Daniel closed his eyes. I told him I was scared and asked if he could come sit with me for a while. My voice trembled slightly. Do you know what he said? No one spoke. I turned to Daniel. You told me you were too busy, I said quietly. A murmur spread across the guests again. Daniel immediately spoke up. That's not the whole story. But I continued calmly. You told me you had an important dinner with clients. I looked back at the crowd. So I spent that night alone in my hospital bed. A few people visibly winced. But that wasn't the part that broke my heart, I said. The tension in the room tightened again. The next morning, just before they wheeled me into surgery, the nurse came into my room with something in her hands. Daniel looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. It was a document. Guests frowned in confusion. A legal document, I clarified. And then I said the sentence that made the bride slowly step away from Daniel. It was paperwork my son had asked the hospital to have me sign. Gasps filled the room again. Daniel ran a hand over his face. Mom, stop twisting this. But I raised my hand. The document, I said, my voice steady, was a power of attorney form. People began whispering loudly now. Yes, I continued. My son wanted control of my finances, just hours before my heart surgery. The bride looked at Daniel in disbelief. You did what? She whispered. Daniel tried to speak. It wasn't like that. But I shook my head sadly. The nurse asked me if I understood what the document meant. I paused. And I told her yes. I looked around the room slowly. But I also told her something else. The guests leaned in again. I told her I would never sign it. Daniel stared at the floor. So the nurse tore up the document and threw it away. Several people in the room actually clapped quietly in support. Daniel's voice was now shaky. I was just trying to help you manage things. I looked at him gently. No, Daniel, I said. You were trying to claim what you thought would soon belong to you. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before. And then I said the part that truly changed the mood of the entire wedding. You see, after that day, I realized something. The guests waited. My son wasn't worried about losing me. My voice was calm but firm. He was worried about losing what I had. Daniel's bride slowly removed her hand from his arm. The distance between them suddenly felt enormous. I took a deep breath and lifted the microphone again. So today, when my son told me I looked disgusting and that I was embarrassing him, I paused. I finally understood something very clearly. Daniel whispered desperately, Mom, please stop. But I looked at the crowd and finished the sentence. I realized that the boy I raised had become a man I barely recognized. A woman in the audience wiped tears from her eyes. And then I said something that made Daniel look up instantly. But there's one thing my son still doesn't know. His voice came out hoarse. What now? I gave a small, knowing smile. Because while Daniel was busy planning this beautiful wedding, I paused. I was quietly planning something else. The room leaned forward again. And what happened earlier today, before this ceremony even started? I took a breath. Is the real reason none of you will ever see my son treat me that way again. Daniel's face went completely pale. Mom, what did you do? I looked straight at him. And then I said quietly, Oh honey, when I told Daniel that something had already happened earlier that day, something he didn't know about yet, the look on his face changed completely. The anger that had been burning in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by something much heavier. Confusion. And fear. The entire room was staring at me now. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes, but strangely, I didn't feel nervous anymore. In fact, for the first time in a very long time, I felt calm. Daniel swallowed hard. Mom, what are you talking about? He asked. His voice wasn't loud anymore. It had that shaky edge to it that people get when they sense something big is coming. I held the microphone gently and took a slow breath. You see, Daniel, I said softly. After everything that happened last year, after the hospital, after the document you tried to make me sign, I paused. I started thinking very carefully about my life. The guests listened quietly. I started asking myself something important. My voice softened. What kind of example had I set for my son? Daniel frowned slightly. What does that even mean? He said. I looked at him. For most of your life, Daniel, I protected you. Memories rushed through my mind like old photographs. When you made mistakes as a teenager, I defended you. When you got in trouble at school, I believed your side of the story. When your first business failed and you lost thousands of dollars, I gave a small smile. I used my savings to help you start again. A few guests nodded slowly, understanding the pattern now. I spent my entire life making sure you never had to face the full consequences of your choices. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. But after the hospital, I continued, I realized something. I looked around the room again. Sometimes love doesn't mean protecting someone. The room was silent. Sometimes love means letting them finally face the truth. Daniel let out a frustrated laugh. So this is all just some kind of lesson, he said. I tilted my head slightly. Oh, it's a lesson, I replied calmly. But not the kind you think. A ripple of curiosity spread through the guests again. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Mom, seriously, what did you do today? I took a small breath before answering. This morning, I said slowly. After I left the lawyer's office. Daniel's shoulders tensed. I made one more stop. Where? He asked. I looked straight at him. I visited your company. The reaction was immediate. Daniel's head snapped up. What? Several guests who clearly worked with him exchanged confused looks. You went to my office? He asked. I nodded. Yes. His voice rose slightly. Why would you do that? I smiled faintly. Well, sweetheart, because I needed to have a conversation with someone very important. Daniel stared at me. Who? I paused long enough that the room leaned in again. Your boss. Gasps spread through the crowd. Daniel blinked several times. You're joking. But I simply shook my head. No. The color drained from his face. What did you say to him? Daniel asked slowly. I adjusted my grip on the microphone. I told him the truth. A murmur rolled through the guests again. I told him about the hospital. Daniel's breathing grew heavier. I told him about the power of attorney document. His bride looked at him with growing concern. And I told him something else too. Daniel whispered. What? I looked at him quietly. I told him about the way you've been treating the person who spent her entire life supporting you. The room felt tense again. Daniel suddenly let out a nervous laugh. That doesn't matter. My boss wouldn't care about something like that. I raised my eyebrows slightly. Oh, I wouldn't be so sure. Daniel frowned. What is that supposed to mean? I leaned closer to the microphone. Well, I said softly. It turns out your boss cares a great deal about how his employees treat people. Daniel's jaw tightened. So what? I looked at him. So when I finished telling him everything. I paused. He made a phone call. Daniel's voice dropped. To who? I gave a small smile. To the company's HR director. A wave of whispers swept through the hall. Daniel looked like he had stopped breathing. And then I said the sentence that made several guests cover their mouths in shock. And about 30 minutes ago. I took a breath. While you were busy greeting your wedding guests. Daniel whispered desperately. Mom. But I finished the sentence anyway. Your boss officially decided to review some very serious complaints about your behavior at work. The room erupted with quiet murmurs. Daniel looked completely stunned. You reported me? He said. I shook my head gently. No, Daniel. I simply told the truth. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then I added something that made his face go completely white. And based on what your boss told me before I left his office. I paused. You might not have a job waiting for you on Monday. The tension in the room exploded into whispers. Daniel stood frozen. And then I said quietly into the microphone. But that still isn't the biggest surprise waiting for my son tonight. Daniel slowly looked up at me. What else could there possibly be? I gave him a calm, steady look. And said softly. Because the person who truly needed to hear this story tonight. I glanced toward the entrance of the wedding hall. Has just arrived. And when Daniel turned around to see who had walked through those doors, his entire world was about to collapse in a way he never expected. When I said the person who truly needed to hear this story had just arrived, every head in that wedding hall turned toward the entrance at the same time. The heavy wooden doors had quietly opened. For a moment, no one seemed to recognize the man standing there. But Daniel did. And the moment he saw him, the color drained from his face faster than I had ever seen before. What is he doing here? Daniel whispered. The man stepped inside slowly, looking around the room with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from someone who knows exactly why they've been invited. He was dressed in a simple suit. Not flashy. Not trying to impress anyone. But the moment a few guests recognized him, whispers immediately spread across the room. Because he wasn't just another guest. He was Daniel's boss. The same man I had visited earlier that morning. I watched Daniel's shoulders stiffen. His bride looked between them in confusion. That's your boss, right? She asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer. He was staring at the floor. The man walked closer until he reached the edge of the reception floor. Then he nodded politely toward me. "Mrs. Carter," he said warmly. "Thank you for inviting me." Several guests gasped quietly. Daniel finally snapped his head up. "You invited him?" he said sharply. I nodded. "Yes." The boss glanced at Daniel for a moment, then looked back at the crowd. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said politely. Someone in the audience actually laughed nervously. "Oh, you're not interrupting," I said calmly. "You're right on time." Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. "This is insane," he muttered. His boss walked a little closer and spoke in a calm voice. "Daniel, I didn't expect to see you here like this today." Daniel forced a stiff smile. "Well, it's my wedding." The man nodded. "Yes, I can see that." There was an awkward pause. Then he added something that immediately tightened the air in the room again. "But after the conversation I had this morning with your mother." Daniel quickly interrupted. "She's exaggerating things." But his boss raised a hand gently. "I'd like to speak for a moment if that's all right." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Daniel's bride slowly stepped away from him again, creating even more distance between them. His boss looked at the guests briefly before continuing. "I normally wouldn't discuss workplace matters at a personal event," he said calmly. "But since the situation was brought to my attention in a very unusual way." He glanced at me kindly. I felt it was important to address it immediately. Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear. "Sir, this really isn't the place." But the man continued. "Daniel, when your mother visited my office today, she didn't come to accuse you." He paused. "She came to thank me." Several guests looked confused. Daniel frowned. "Thank you for what?" The man folded his hands in front of him. "She thanked me for giving you opportunities over the years." Daniel blinked. "And then she told me something that concerned me deeply." The bride crossed her arms. "What did she say?" The boss answered calmly. "She told me about the hospital situation." More whispers spread. Daniel shook his head quickly. "This is being blown way out of proportion." But his boss continued speaking in that same steady tone. "As part of my job, I'm responsible for the character of the people who represent our company." He looked directly at Daniel. "And unfortunately, this isn't the first concern we've received about your behavior." Daniel's eyes widened. "What?" Several people in the audience murmured again. The boss nodded slowly. "There have been complaints from colleagues about how you treat staff members." Daniel immediately spoke up. "That's ridiculous." But the boss didn't argue. "Maybe," he said calmly. "That's exactly what the review process will determine." Daniel's hands were trembling now. "You can't seriously be doing this right now." The boss gave a small, sympathetic shrug. "Actually, Daniel, this process started the moment your mother walked into my office this morning." The room buzzed with tension. Then he said the sentence that hit Daniel harder than anything else that night. "Until that review is complete." He paused. "You've been placed on administrative leave." Gasps spread through the crowd again. Daniel's voice cracked. "You're suspending me?" The boss sighed. "I'm protecting the company while we investigate." Daniel looked around the room helplessly. His bride stared at him with disbelief. I stood quietly beside the microphone. And then I said something that made the room fall silent once again. "You see, Daniel." He slowly turned toward me. "For years you believed you could treat people however you wanted." My voice was calm but firm. "Because there would never be consequences." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "But tonight," I continued gently, "you finally met the one thing you've been avoiding your entire life." He swallowed hard. "What?" I looked him straight in the eyes. "The truth." The room stayed silent for several seconds. And then something unexpected happened. Daniel's bride stepped forward. She looked at him for a long moment, and then quietly asked a question that changed everything again. "Daniel." Her voice trembled slightly. "Is any of this actually true?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. And in that moment, everyone in that room realized the wedding itself might not survive the night. When Daniel's bride asked if any of it was true, the silence in the hall felt almost unbearable. Every single guest was staring at him, waiting. Daniel opened his mouth once, then closed it again. For the first time that entire evening, my confident, successful son looked completely lost. Emily, he finally said, his voice unsteady, but she didn't move closer. In fact, she took another small step back. Just answer the question, she said quietly. Her eyes weren't angry. They were hurt. And somehow that made the moment even heavier. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. It's not exactly like she's saying, he muttered. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Emily folded her arms. So you did send paperwork to the hospital? Daniel hesitated. That wasn't. Yes or no, Daniel? The firmness in her voice surprised everyone, including him. After a long pause, he looked down. Yes. Several guests gasped softly. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. And the complaints at work? Daniel shifted his weight. People exaggerate things. That wasn't the denial anyone hoped for. She opened her eyes again and studied him carefully. And the way you spoke to your mother tonight. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room had heard it. Emily looked toward me for a brief moment. Our eyes met. There was something in her expression that felt almost like an apology. Then she turned back to Daniel. You told me your mom was dramatic, she said quietly. You told me she always tried to make things about herself. Daniel swallowed hard. Emily, please. But what I just heard tonight. She shook her head slowly. That wasn't drama. Her voice broke slightly. That was a mother begging her son to care about her. The room was completely silent again. Daniel stepped toward her. Look, this is all just a misunderstanding that got out of control. But Emily stepped back again. No, she said softly. It's not. She looked around at the guests, then at Daniel's boss, then back at me, and finally at Daniel. You know what the worst part is? She asked. Daniel looked desperate now. What? Her voice was calm, but firm. I believed you. She took a slow breath. I believed the way you talked about people. Daniel reached for her hand, but she didn't take it. Instead, she slowly lifted her left hand and looked down at the wedding ring he had placed there only a few hours earlier. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel noticed where she was looking. Emily, don't do this. She slid the ring off her finger. Gasps echoed across the hall. Emily, Daniel said quickly, panic rising in his voice. But she gently placed the ring into his hand. I can't marry someone who treats people like this, she said quietly. Daniel looked stunned. This is crazy. You're ending our wedding because of a speech. She shook her head. No. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm ending it because tonight showed me who you really are. The words hit him harder than anything else that had been said all evening. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the ring in his palm. Emily turned toward me. For a moment it looked like she didn't know what to say. Then she walked over and gently took my hands. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I squeezed her hands softly. You have nothing to apologize for, dear. She gave me a small, grateful smile, then quietly walked toward the exit. Several guests moved aside to let her pass. Some of them even followed. Within minutes, nearly half the wedding hall had emptied. Daniel stood alone near the center of the room, still holding the ring, still processing everything that had just happened. His boss shook his head slowly and walked toward the door. We'll speak Monday, he said quietly before leaving. Eventually, the music stopped. The lights felt too bright. And the celebration that Daniel had spent months planning had turned into something no one would ever forget. He finally looked up at me. For the first time in years, there were tears in his eyes. Mom, he said hoarsely. But I simply placed the microphone down on the table, because there was nothing left to say. Sometimes the hardest lessons in life don't come from words. They come from consequences. And that night, my son finally met his. But as I slowly walked toward the exit myself, I realized something that surprised even me. Because the story between a mother and her son doesn't always end when the truth finally comes out.